John Marion Grant, born on April 12, 1961. He was convicted of stabbing a prison cafeteria worker. Grant was serving what amounts to a life sentence on multiple robbery charges when he killed Gay Carter. Grant was working in the prison cafeteria, where Carter supervised a group of men incarcerated at the facility, but after he got into a fight with another inmate, Carter removed him from his position. Witnesses testified that Grant became enraged and dragged Carter into a mock closet, where he stabbed her more than a dozen times with a makeshift knife. Grant was the first inmate to be executed since a series of flawed lethal injections in 2014 and 2015. He was serving a 130-year prison sentence for several armed robberies when witnesses say he dragged Gay Carter, a prison cafeteria worker, into a mock closet and stabbed her 16 times with a homemade shank. He was sentenced to death in 1999. Oklahoma had one of the nation's busiest death chambers until problems in 2014 and 2015 led to a de facto moratorium. Richard Glossop was just hours away from being executed in September 2015 when prison officials realized they received the wrong lethal drug. It was later learned the same wrong drug had been used to execute an inmate in January 2015. In 2014, another botched execution saw Clayton Lockett struggle on a gurney before dying 43 minutes into his lethal injection. Execution drugs have become increasingly difficult for states to find over the last decade, as the companies that manufacture them have denounced their use in lethal injections. States often look to compounding pharmacies, which make drugs for patients with specific needs, like creating a liquid form of a common pill for a patient who can't swallow solid objects, to recreate the drugs of choice. While the moratorium was in place, Oklahoma moved ahead with plans to use nitrogen gas to execute inmates, but ultimately scrapped that idea and announced last year that it planned to resume executions using the same three-drug lethal injection protocol that was used during the flawed executions. The three drugs are midazolam, a sedative, vicuronium bromide, a paralytic, and potassium chloride, which stops the heart. Oklahoma prison officials recently announced that they had confirmed a source to supply all the drugs needed for Grant's execution, plus 6 more that are scheduled to take place through March. According to the Department of Corrections, extensive validations and redundancies have been implemented since the last execution in order to ensure that the process works as intended. More than 24 Oklahoma death row inmates are part of a federal lawsuit challenging the state's lethal injection protocols, arguing that the three-drug method risks causing unconstitutional pain and suffering. A trial is scheduled for early next year. Grant and his attorneys did not deny that he killed Carter, but argued that important facts about the crime and Grant's troubled childhood were never presented to the jury. They maintained that Grant developed deep feelings for Carter and was upset when she fired him after he got in a fight with another kitchen worker. Jurors never heard that Mr. Grant killed Miss Gay Carter, while in the heat of passion and despair over the abrupt end of the deepest and most important adult relationship of his life. His attorneys wrote in his clemency application. On October 28, 2021, John Marion Grant was executed. Grant was escorted into the execution chamber at around 4 p.m. on Thursday, the 28th of October 2021. As he walked to the death chamber, Grant was shouting, "Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!" followed by profanities. Almost immediately after receiving the sedative midazolam, the first of the 3 drugs administered, including vicuronium bromide, a paralytic, and potassium chloride to stop the heart, Grant began convulsing and vomiting. His arms outstretched and body bound to the execution gurney, John Marion Grant turned his head as a sedative. The first dose of his deadly drip flowed through the IV and into his veins. Grant exhaled. Then, his entire body convulsed. Grant's body shook and jerked nearly 24 times before vomit spurted from his mouth and spilled down his neck. The 60-year-old was still alive as members of the execution team entered and wiped the sick off Grant's face. Minutes passed and he was unconscious by 4:15 p.m. The second and third drugs in the 3-part lethal cocktail came a minute later. Another minute passed before Grant stopped breathing. He was declared dead at 4:21 p.m. Grant's reaction to the sedative midazolam is potential fodder for death penalty critics. Since his execution formally ends a 6-year hiatus in Oklahoma following concerns over a string of botched lethal injections. In a statement, the Oklahoma Department of Corrections said Grant's execution was carried out in accordance with protocols and without complication. Most people believe Grant's execution was a human experiment for the other death row inmates involved in the lawsuit over the state's execution process. 3 botched lethal injections in Oklahoma, including the executions of Clayton Lockett, who in 2014 writhed in pain for 40 minutes before he died, and Charles Warner, whose last words were "My body is on fire," after an unauthorized drug was used on him. Richard Glossop's execution was suddenly called off in 2015 when the state again received the wrong drugs. Glossop is still alive. A grand jury in 2016 called the state's lethal injection process an inexcusable failure. Oklahoma, which was the first to use lethal injections, is highly secretive about the process. Oklahoma officials do not divulge their protocols, the source of the lethal drugs, or how they train their staff. They have tried to be at the forefront of different ways of executing people. It says something about the state. And definitely says something about its Department of Corrections and its effort to be the first and try new things despite them ending in debacle. Thank you for watching Death Row.